Everyone. Welcome. This is the January 6, 2020 annual organizational meeting of the Haverford Township Board of Commissioners for calendar year 2020. The first item of business is the roll call. Mr. D'Amelio.
Here.
Mr. Oliva.
Here.
Mr. McCluskey.
Here.
Mr. Siegel.
Here.
Mr. Lewis.
Here.
Mr. Holmes.
Here.
Mr. Quinn.
Here.
Dr. Hart.
Here.
Mr. Wexler.
Here.
And now I'd ask you to please rise as we ask Chief John Viola to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
God bless America.
Once again, good evening. My name is Dave Berman, and I'm the Township Manager for Haverford Township. I'll chair this meeting very briefly. I thank you all for joining us this evening, whether here in person or tuning in from home. The first part of the meeting is the swearing in of our newly elected or re-elected commissioners. First, I'd ask Commissioner-elect Stephen D'Amelio to come forward to be sworn in by the Honorable Robert R. Burke.
Somebody hold the Bible. Yeah, one of them.
I'm going to hand that to you, and if you could stand off to the side so we can get a couple pictures.
Wherever you're sure. Which way you want to stand?
Either way, you just got to go off to the side.
Off to the side. Where do you want me?
Right next to the judge.
Oh. Left hand, right? Yeah. I'm going to raise my right hand.
That's it, yeah. Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Place your left hand on the Holy Bible. Raise your right hand, please. And repeat after me.
I,
State your name.
Stephen D'Amelio,
Do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
or affirm
or affirm
that I will support, obey, and defend
that I will support, obey, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth.
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
And I will discharge the duties of my office
and I will discharge the duties of my office
as Commissioner in Haverford Township,
as Commissioner in Haverford Township,
Delaware County,
Delaware County,
with fidelity.
with fidelity.
Congratulations. You may kiss the
Do you want to get a couple pictures of your family?
Yeah.
And next, we have Commissioner-elect Kevin McCluskey. He'll be sworn in by the Honorable Elisa C. Lasianka.
You're going to put your left hand on the Bible and the right hand in the air. So, whatever works. Okay. I, Kevin McCluskey,
I, Kevin McCluskey,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, obey, and defend
that I will support, obey, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and that I will discharge the duties
and I will discharge the duties
of Commissioner
of Commissioner
in Haverford Township,
in Haverford Township,
Delaware County,
with fidelity.
with fidelity. Congratulations.
You want to get a photo?
I told him he could hold it. It's okay, you could just say cheese. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, we have Andy Lewis. also to be sworn in by the Honorable Lisa Lasianka. Yeah, that'd be terrific. Thank you.
Left hand on the Bible, right hand in the air. I, Andy Lewis,
I, Andy Lewis,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, obey, and defend
that I will support, obey, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and I will discharge the duties of Commissioner
and I will discharge the duties of Commissioner
in Haverford Township,
in Haverford Township,
Delaware County,
Delaware County,
with fidelity.
with fidelity.
Congratulations. Oh, we're going to that. Oh, one more.
Thank you.
Good luck. Yep. Oh, thank you, sir. And I have a whole bunch of
Is your family?
Good.
Yep.
Commissioner-elect Connor Quinn, being sworn in 7th Ward. I, Connor Quinn,
I, Connor Quinn,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, obey, and defend
that I will support, obey, and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this
and
Commonwealth,
the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and I will discharge the duties
and I will discharge the duties
of Commissioner
of Commissioner
in Haverford Township,
in Haverford Township,
Delaware County,
or Delaware County,
with fidelity.
with fidelity.
Congratulations.
Squish it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And next, we have Bill Wexler to be sworn in by the Honorable, I got the wrong piece of paper, Robert D'Agostino. How'd I do? Not good. Thanks.
George is gonna hold?
I, and state your name,
I, Bill Wexler,
do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support, obey, and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support, obey, and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and the Constitution of this Commonwealth,
and I will discharge the duties
and I will discharge the duties
of Commissioner
of Commissioner
in Haverford Township,
in Haverford Township,
Delaware County,
Delaware County,
with fidelity.
with fidelity.
Congratulations.
That's good.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a few minutes to recess so that the folks can get squared away. Any families can speak with their loved ones, and we can move on with the meeting shortly after that.
He's still out there.
Is he still out there?
Yeah.
All right, one more minute. Good evening once again. Before we move into the next part of our meeting, I want to take a moment to thank the Board of Commissioners for your service to this community. There are times, believe it or not, that being a commissioner can be a thankless job. But during my short time here, I've worked closely with each of you on a variety of issues, and I've really learned how deeply all of you are committed to this township and to protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the residents and to enhancing the quality of life for the people who live here in Haverford Township. On behalf of all the employees, I thank all of the commissioners very much for your dedication and support.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And at this time, we will accept nominations for President of the Board of Commissioners for calendar year 2020.
I'd like to nominate Bill Wexler to be our next President of the Board of Commissioners.
I'll second that.
Seconded by Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Township Manager, I move we close nominations.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Lewis. All those in favor of closing the nominations?
Aye.
The nominations are closed. I'll call the roll. Mr. D'Amelio.
Commissioner Wexler.
Mr. Oliva.
Commissioner Wexler.
Mr. McCluskey.
Bill Wexler.
Mr. Siegel.
Bill Wexler.
Mr. Lewis.
Bill Wexler.
Mr. Holmes.
Commissioner Wexler.
Mr.
Commissioner Wexler.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn.
Bill Wexler.
Dr. Hart.
Bill Wexler.
And Mr. Wexler.
I'll go with Mr. Wexler, thank you.
Want to do the shuffle after? Yeah, do the shuffle. Do after.
We'll do it.
Yeah, do it after. BP.
I'd like to thank all of you for your vote of confidence. I tend to serve you well and move along. I'd like to thank Mr. Lewis for last year's chairing of the meetings and being president. You did a great job, and I hope I can fill your shoes with just as good a service. So thank you all. Move on to item number 4, which is nominations for Vice President of the Board of Commissioners.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to nominate Larry Holmes for Vice President.
Second.
Motion made for Mr. Holmes, seconded by Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. D'Amelio?
I'd like to make a motion to nominate Jerry Hart.
Second. Nomination for Mr. Hart, made and seconded. Any other nominations? Would entertain a motion to close nominations then?
So moved.
Second.
Made and seconded. All in favor of closing nominations?
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Berman, would you call the roll?
Mr. D'Amelio.
Commissioner Hart.
Mr. Oliva.
Commissioner Holmes.
Mr. McCluskey.
Larry Holmes.
Mr. Siegel.
Commissioner Holmes.
Mr. Lewis.
Larry Holmes.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Quinn.
Harry Hart.
Dr. Hart.
Larry Holmes.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Holmes.
Congratulations. The same thing.
You can take this.
I'm here. Wait. The mouse. Just pull that.
We'll just swap the cable. I got you. You swap more. Cool.
You want to just... Yes, sir.
Whose is this one?
Thank you.
this one.
I guess that would be Connor. Let's just staple it for now.
Yeah, we'll move on the old-fashioned way and use the paper.
Yeah, all right.
Next item on the agenda is the appointments, administrative appointments. First item, number 5, is the Township Solicitor.
President?
Mr. Siegel.
Motion to appoint, reappoint Jim Byrne, Nicole Byrne, firm as township solicitor.
Second?
Motion made and seconded for McNichol, Byrne, and Metlowski, led by Mr. Jim Byrne.
Mr. President,
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I move we close nominations.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Byrne.
Mr. Oliva.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. McCluskey.
Byrne McNichol.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Quinn.
Jim Byrne.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Byrne.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Byrne. Congratulations. Our next item is Civil Service Solicitor.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. D'Amelio.
I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Kevin O'Neill to serve as civil service solicitor for a one-year term to expire December 31st.
Second?
Motion made and seconded for Kevin O'Neill.
Motion to close.
Second?
Motion made to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Oliva.
Kevin O'Neill.
Mr. McCluskey.
Kevin O'Neill.
Mr. Siegel.
Kevin O'Neill.
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. O'Neill.
Mr. Quinn.
Kevin O'Neill.
Dr. Hart.
Kevin O'Neill.
Mr. Holmes.
Attorney O'Neill.
Mr. Wexler.
Kevin O'Neill. Congratulations, Mr. O'Neill. Is he here? Yeah. At this time, I'd ask the Township Manager if he has a recommendation for the appointment of Township Engineer.
Mr. Wexler, the Township Manager recommends Dave Pannoni of Pannoni to be the Township Engineer. Chuck Faulkner as well. I guess we use Chuck Faulkner as the name. We've been working with both. Okay, thank you very much. Dave Pannoni of Pannoni Associates.
Mr. President,
Mr. Holmes.
President, I move that we approve the Township Manager's recommendation of Benoni and Associates as Township Engineer.
Second?
Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Congratulations, Mr. Pannoni. Item 6 is Resolution 2167, 2020.
Mr. President,
Mr. Oliva.
I make a motion to adopt resolution number 2167, 2020, appointing the following boards and commissions.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next item is appointment, Civil Service Commission.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lewis.
motion to reappoint Bernie McCabe to serve on the Civil Service Commission for a 6-year term to expire December 31st,
Second?
says 2020.
Second?
2020.
Right, 2026.
Mr. President,
Motion made and seconded. Mr. McCluskey.
make a motion to appoint Leo Paul to serve on the Civil Service Commission for a 6-year term to expire December 31st, 2020.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Leo Paul. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
One
Second.
clarification, it says a 6-year term.
It's a 6-year term, so it should be December 31st, 2025.
That's what I wanted to just clarify.
Yeah. Typo.
It is a 6-year term.
This is a 6-year term.
Yeah, so that's a typo.
Okay, so the appointment or reappointment is for a 6-year term through December 31st, 2025. 2 nominations, Mr. Leo Paul, Mr. Bernie McCabe. Was there a second to close?
I did.
Motion made and second. All in favor to close nominations?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne, would you please call the roll?
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. McCabe.
Mr. Oliva.
Bernie McCabe.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Paul.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. McCabe.
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. McCabe.
Mr. Holmes. I'm sorry, Mr. Quinn,
McCabe.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. McCabe.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. McCabe.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. McCabe. Congratulations, Mr. McCabe. Next item is the Friends of the Grange. This is one-year terms.
Mr. President,
Mr. Oliva.
I make a motion we appoint Chad Brooks to serve on the Friends of the Grange for a one-year term to expire December 31st, 2020.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Brooks.
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion made, second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Oliva,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. McCluskey,
Brooks.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Quinn,
Mr. Brooks.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Chad Brooks. Congratulations, Chad.
Okay.
Second position for the Friends of the Grange,
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. D'Amelio.
I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Tony D. Curtis to serve on the Friends of the Grange for a one-year term to expire December 31st, 2020.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. DeCurtis.
Motion to close.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Mr. D. Curtis.
Mr. Oliva,
Mr. DeCurtis.
Mr. McCluskey,
Mr. Curtis.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. DeCurtis.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. DeCurtis.
Mr. Quinn,
DeCurtis.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. DeCurtis.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. DeCurtis.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. DeCurtis. And the third position for the Friends of the Grange,
Mr. President,
yes.
for the third position, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Tony Weissman.
Tim.
I'm sorry, Tim. Tim,
Second.
Tim Weissman.
can I finish?
I thought you were finished.
No, to serve on the Friends of the Grange for 1 year.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Weissman. Your motion to close?
Motion closed.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. Oliva,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. McCluskey,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. Quinn,
Westman.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Westman.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Westman.
and Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Westman. Next group is the Health Advisory Board. These are five-year terms.
I would like to make a motion to appoint Henry Ike or Eichman to serve on the Health Advisory Board for a 5-year term to expire on December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Motion made for Mr. Eichmann.
Motion to close.
Motion to close
Second.
and seconded. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. Oliva,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. McCluskey,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. Quinn,
Eichman.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Eichman.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Eichman.
and Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Eichmann. Second vacant position.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lewis.
I'd like to make a motion to appoint Dr. Shah Hassan to serve on the Health Advisory Board for a 5-year term to expire on December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Dr. Hassan. Your motion to close?
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. Oliva,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. McCluskey,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. Siegel,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. Lewis,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. Quinn,
Dr. Hassan.
Dr. Hart,
Dr. Hassan.
Mr. Holmes,
Dr. Hassan.
and Mr. Wexler.
Dr. Hassan. Third position for the Health Advisory Board, 5-year term.
Mr. President,
Mr. Oliva.
I'd like to make a motion to appoint Eric Wiest to to serve on the Health Advisory Board for a 5-year term to expire on December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Mr. President,
Mr. Holmes.
President, I would like to appoint Sophia Seisler for the Health Advisory Board.
Second.
Motion made for Sophia Seisler. Any other nominations for this position? Your motion to close?
So moved.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Berman, please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. West.
Mr. Oliva.
Eric Weist.
Weist, sorry.
Mr. McCluskey.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Siegel.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Lewis.
Eric Weist.
Mr. Quinn. Dr. Hart.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Wexler. I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Weist. Last,
Mr.
fifth
Pre-
position.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to appoint Danielle Carrasco to serve on the Health Advisory Board for a 5-year term to expire on December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Mr. President, I'd like to appoint Dr. Seisler to the
Dr.
Health
Seisler.
Advisory Board.
Second.
Motion made and seconded. Motion to close?
So
Motion.
moved.
Second, please.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Daniel Casaco?
Alaska.
Carrasco.
Carrasco, sorry.
Mr. Oliva.
Danielle Carrasco.
Mr. McCluskey.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Siegel.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Lewis.
Danielle Carrasco.
Mr. Holmes. I'm sorry, Mr. Quinn.
Danielle Carrasco.
Dr. Hart.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Holmes.
Dr. Seisler.
Mr. Wexler.
Danielle Carrasco. Congratulations, Mr. Weist and Danielle Carrasco, Dr. Hassan, and Mr. Eichmann, the Health Advisory Board. Historical Commission, this is for a 4-year term.
Mr. President, I'd like to
Mr.
make a
Lewis.
motion to reappoint Dr. Keith Swift to serve on the Historical Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2023.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Dr. Swift.
Motion to close?
Second.
Motion made and seconded to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Dr. Swift.
Mr. Oliva.
Keith Swift.
Mr. McCluskey.
Keith Swift.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Swift.
Mr. Lewis.
Keith Swift.
Mr. Quinn.
Keith Swift.
Dr. Hart.
Keith Swift.
Mr. Holmes.
Keith Swift.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Swift, Dr. Swift. Congratulations, Dr. Swift. Another appointment for the Health Advisory Board.
Historical.
Historical, I'm sorry, Historical.
I would like to appoint Brian Ramona to serve on the Historical Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2023.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Brian Ramona. Any other nominations?
Motion to close?
Second.
Motion made, seconded. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Brian Ramona?
Mr. Oliva.
Brian Ramona.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Ramona.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Ramona.
Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Ramona.
Mr. Quinn.
Brian Ramona.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Ramona.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Ramona.
Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Ramona. Congratulations, Mr. Ramona. Next item is 2 appointments for the Human Relations Commission. These are for a 3-year term.
Mr. President.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I move that we reappoint Joanne Glussman to the Human Relations Commission.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Joanne Glusman.
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion made to close. All in favor?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Joanne Glossman?
Mr. Oliva.
Joanne Glossman.
Mr. McCluskey.
Ms. Glussman.
Mr. Siegel.
Ms. Glassman.
Mr. Lewis.
Ms. Glusman.
Mr. Quinn,
Ms. Glassman?
Dr. Hart,
Ms. Glassman.
Mr. Holmes,
Joanne Glesman.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Glesman. Congratulations.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lewis.
I'd like to nominate Laura Cavender to serve on the Human Relations Commission for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2022.
Second?
Motion made and seconded for Laura Cavender.
Motion to close.
Second?
Motion to close. All in favor?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Nay.
One nay.
Is it one nay?
Any other
Want to
nays?
make another motion?
I did. It happened pretty fast. I'd like to move.
I'll withdraw.
Thank you.
Is there another nomination?
There's another nomination. I would like to nominate
Second
Lisanne.
on withdrawal, no.
I'm good.
Go ahead.
I'd like to nominate Lisanne McCullough.
Second.
Now I'll make a motion to close.
Second?
Motion made
I
and
won't
seconded.
object.
All in favor of closing the nominations?
Aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Thank you. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Laura Cavender.
Mr. Oliva,
Laura Cavender.
Mr. McCluskey,
Laura Cavender.
Mr. Siegel,
Ms. McCullough.
Mr. Lewis,
Laura Cavender.
Mr. Quinn,
Ms. Cavender.
Dr. Hart,
Ms. McCullough.
Mr. Holmes,
Attorney McCullough.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. McCool. Congratulations, Ms. Cavender. Next group of appointments is for the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board. These are for a 3-year term.
Mr. President,
Mr. Oliva.
I'd like to reappoint Adam Terranova to serve on the Ice Rink Advisory Board for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2022.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Terranova. Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion made and seconded to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Adam Terranova.
Mr. Oliva,
Adam Terranova.
Mr. McCluskey,
Mr. Terranova.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Terranova.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Terranova.
Mr. Quinn,
Oh, Terranova.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Terranova.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Terranova.
and Mr. Wexler.
Adam Terranova. Congratulations, Adam.
Mr. President,
Yes.
I'd like to make a motion to appoint Kate Stickle to serve on the Ice Rink Advisory Board for a 3-year term to expire December 31st, 2020.
Motion for Kate Stickle. Any other nominations? Or motion to close?
Motion to close.
Or second?
Second.
Motion made and second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Kate Stickle.
Mr. Oliva,
Kate Stickle.
Mr. McCluskey,
Ms. Stickle.
Mr. Siegel,
Stickle.
Mr. Lewis,
Kate Stickle.
Mr. Quinn,
Kate Stickle.
Dr. Hart,
Ms. Stickle.
Mr. Holmes,
Ms. Stickle.
and Mr. Wexler.
Kate Stickle. Congratulations, Mr. One more position for the Ice Skating Rink Advisory Board.
President?
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I move that we reappoint Karen Samuelanis to the Ice Rink Advisory Board.
Second.
Motion made and seconded from Ms. Samuelina.
Motion to close?
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Object.
motion to appoint Rob Cohen to the Ice Skating Rink Commission.
Motion for Rob Cohen. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion made and seconded from Mr. Cohen.
Motion to close?
Second.
Motion made and second. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Please call the roll, Mr. Berman.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Karen Semulanis.
Mr. Oliva,
Karen Semelinas.
Mr. McCluskey,
Ms. Samuelinas.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Quinn,
Rob Cohen.
Dr. Hart,
Rob Cohen.
Mr. Holmes,
Ms. Samuelinas.
and Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Cohen. Congratulations, Mr. Cohen. Next appointment is for the Library Board of Trustees. This is for a 3-year term for an appointment by the Board of Commissioners to the Library Board of Trustees.
Mr. President, I'd like to nominate Mr. Jim Brown.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Jim Brown.
Motion to close?
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Brown.
Mr. Oliva,
Jim Brown.
Mr. McCluskey,
Brown.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Quinn,
Mr. Brown.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Brown.
and Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Brown. Congratulations, Mr. Brown. Parks and Recreation Board, 5-year term, 1 position.
Mr. President,
Mr. Oliva.
I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Steve Cole to serve on the Parks and Rec Board for a 5-year term to expire December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Motion for Mr. Steve Cole. Any other nominations?
Motion to close?
Second.
Motion to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Opposed. Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Mr. Cole.
Mr. Oliva,
Mr. Cole?
Mr. McCluskey,
Mr. Cole.
Mr. Siegel,
Mr. Cole.
Mr. Lewis,
Mr. Call.
Mr. Quinn,
Stephen Cole.
Dr. Hart,
Mr. Cole.
Mr. Holmes,
Mr. Cole.
and Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Cole.
Mr. President, before we move on, could I just make one point about that appointment? We had a number of outstanding candidates who interviewed for that position, but our appointee had just been appointed to finish a term that was expiring in 6 months. I do not want to give the public the wrong impression that there wasn't serious consideration to all the Parks and Rec nominees, and there was to all the various nominees that you've heard of this evening. But it would be very difficult for us as a board, just simply 5 or 6 months ago, to appoint somebody to a 6-month term and then turn around and not give them a real shot at a real term once they'd already passed muster with us the first time. So we don't typically explain a lot of these votes, but due to the nature of the significance of this board and the number of people who applied, I just thought it was out of respect for all the applicants that people understood what was going on there.
Thank you very much for that explanation, and well said. Our next item is the Planning Commission. There are 2 positions. These are 4-year terms.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lewis.
motion to appoint Maggie Dobbs to serve on the Planning Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2023.
Sorry. Second.
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion for Maggie Dobbs, motion to close. Any other nominations? All in favor of closing? All
Aye.
right, please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio,
Maggie Dobbs.
Mr. Oliva,
Maggie Dobbs.
Mr. McCluskey,
Ms. Dobbs.
Mr. Siegel,
Ms. Dobbs.
Mr. Lewis,
Maggie Dobbs.
Mr. Quinn,
Ms. Dobbs.
Dr. Hart,
Ms. Dobbs.
Mr. Holmes,
Ms. Dobbs.
Mr. Wexler.
Ms. Dobbs. Second position.
So, or I would like to appoint Brent Bodner to serve on the Planning Commission for a 4-year term to expire on December 31st, 2023.
Second.
Motion for Brent Bodner.
Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Chris Gauman to the Planning Commission.
Second.
I don't think he wanted to be considered. I think he withdrew. I'm almost certain.
When did he withdraw?
He did an interview, and I'm certain he withdrew.
I don't think he withdrew.
I was my understanding that he had withdrawn
Hey, never interviewed.
from Gloria, but anyway, you can still have the vote.
Do you want,
He's on our comprehensive planning committee. I
Motion to
wondered
table.
if he wasn't
We can reappoint him.
running for this again.
President, motion to table.
Second.
motion to table made and seconded. All in favor of tabling this appointment?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion to appoint this position has been tabled. Next group is the Senior Citizens Advisory Committee. These are appointed by ward by each commissioner. I'll ask Ward 1, Mr. D'Amelio, do you have an appointment yet?
Not yet.
Mr. Oliva?
Jack Doherty?
Jack Doherty? Mr. Siegel? Or Mr. McCluskey, I'm sorry.
Patrick Hagan.
Last name again?
Hagan, Hagen.
Mr. Siegel?
Reappoint Mark Cohen.
Mr. Lewis?
To be named.
Okay. Mr. Holmes?
Joanne Gatone. Gatone.
Mr. Quinn?
I'll defer.
Okay. Dr. Hart?
Be named.
And I'll do the same. I'm waiting to hear back from at least 2 people, so. Shade Tree Commission and 5-year term.
Mr. President,
Mr. Lewis?
to appoint Andrew Mink to serve on the Shade Tree Commission for a 5-year term to expire December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Motion made and seconded for Mr. Andrew Mink.
Motion to close.
Second.
All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Andrew Mink?
Mr. Oliva.
Andrew Mink.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Mink.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Mink.
Mr. Lewis.
Mink.
Mr. Quinn.
Mr. Mink.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Mink.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Mink.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Mink. Vacancy Committee, 1-year term. Any nominations from the floor? I'd make a motion then to appoint Matthew Robertson to serve on the Vacancy Committee for a 1-year term to expire December 31st, 2020.
Second.
I second. Sorry, you, Steve.
Any other nominations?
Motion to close.
Second.
Motion to close. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Matthew Robinson?
Mr. Oliva.
Matthew Robinson.
Mr. McCluskey.
Robinson.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Lewis.
Robertson.
Mr. Quinn.
Robertson.
Dr. Hart.
Robertson.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Robertson.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Robertson. Last appointment is the Zoning Hearing Board. This is a 5-year term.
Mr. President.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, I move we appoint Gary Slotnick to serve on the Zoning Hearing Board for a 5-year term to expire on December 31st, 2024.
Motion made. Mr. Slotnick,
Second.
seconded. Any other nominations?
Yes, Mr. President, I'd like to make a motion to reappoint Bob Kane.
Second.
Motion made and seconded to reappoint Mr. Kane. Any other nominations?
President, I move we close nominations.
Second?
Motion made and seconded to close. All in favor of closing?
Aye.
Any opposed? Please call the roll.
Mr. D'Amelio.
Mr. Kane?
Mr. Oliva.
Bob Kane.
Mr. McCluskey.
Mr. Zlotnick.
Mr. Siegel.
Mr. Zlotnick.
Mr. Lewis.
Bob Kane.
Mr. Quinn.
Bob Kane.
Dr. Hart.
Mr. Zlotnick.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Zlotnick.
And Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Kane. Congratulations, Mr. Kane. That completes the appointments for boards and commissions. Unless there's any other public service announcements, that completes the agenda by the charter.
Mr. Commissioner, one announcement. Commissioner Oliva and I will be hosting a meeting at the Manoa Firehouse on January 14th, and it's regarding the billboard case, which is coming before going to actually the Court of Common Pleas. So we'd like to get our residents informed as to what is happening and to possibly attend these hearings down in media and hopefully get a lot of support. You want to say anything? Or?
Oh, no. You're also having a meeting.
Yeah, Mr. President, we're also in the Fifth Ward. We have 2 billboards proposed in the Fifth Ward, and we'll be hosting a public meeting this Thursday evening at the Haverford School in Centennial Hall at 7 p.m., hosted by the Brentford Civic Association, the Bryn Mawr Civic Association, Commissioner Scott Zeloff, and myself, and our solicitor Jim Byrne will be there as well. So we'll have a public meeting. So we'll have 2 public meetings. We'll also be circulating an online petition to residents to sign an online petition in opposition to these billboards, both in the 5th and the 1st and the 2nd wards. So I'll get that out, and I'd ask all our commissioners to circulate that to your email list and try to get people to sign on to these petitions online in opposition to these proposed billboards.
Andy, when will that be ready? Do you know?
It's ready now, actually. I was getting ready to blast it
Yeah,
out.
I would ask you, please circulate that to all of us. This is not just a ward issue.
Yeah,
This
that's
is a
correct.
township issue, township-wide.
Correct.
Every one of our residents drives on Lancaster Avenue and Westchester Pike every day, so this is much bigger than a single or 2 or 3 wards.
Commissioner, just let me say this. I mean, if anybody wants to come to our meetings that we're having, please feel free to do so. It's not just the 1st and 2nd. If you want to come, if you're from the 6th Ward or anywhere else, 4th, come. We welcome everybody.
Right?
Mr. President?
Yes.
I don't think this is the appropriate place to have this discussion, but I would like, at the next meeting, I'd like us to talk about and consider possibly adding another commission and investigating through our solicitor the steps we need to take to create another advisory commission for our board. I think there are 1 or 2 particular issues that aren't going away and aren't within the purview of the current boards and commissions that we have, and I'd like to give a heads up to the public that we want to take advantage of more of the extraordinary applicants who came to us in December and interviewed for these various positions. We don't have enough positions for them, and we had a real embarrassment of britches in terms of applicants, and I want to thank them all, whether you were appointed or not appointed. But I do think there are 1 or 2 issues that we should address through the help of an advisory board. There's going to be a long-term standing board or maybe just an ad hoc board for the year. The second thing I wanted to bring up, Mr. President, is that I think this board needs to go into executive session. I don't think we have to postpone adjourning the meeting as long as we announce before our next meeting that we were in executive session, but I would ask my colleagues to agree to an executive session just for the next, for 5 to 10 minutes after this meeting adjourns.
Is this for a legal or personnel matter?
This is for a legal matter.
I'll advise the
Bless you.
public that we will meet after this meeting in executive session. I will re-announce it prior to our next meeting that we did meet. I also have one other announcement. Next Tuesday night, in competition with the other meeting, is the Bureau of Fire will recognize our volunteer firefighters at the Community Recreation Environmental Center. This is the annual ceremony that recognizes all the hard work that our volunteers, recognition for training, recognition for years of service awards. So I invite every member of the public next Tuesday, the 14th, to go to the CREC next week on Tuesday and show your support for the volunteers of the township. Meeting's at 7 p.m. And we ask any member of the public to please come and offer congratulations to those young people that have gone through 300-plus hours of training to become volunteer firemen, specialized classes, officers that have taken the next step to be the leaders of the volunteer fire organizations, and to recognize years of service by long-term volunteers in all 5 of our fire companies. So that is the 14th at the Community Recreation Environmental Center, and all members of the public are welcome and encouraged to please come. There's refreshments and lots of congratulations. So, and find out about the fire company. If you know any young people that want to come, we would welcome them and let them see what it's all about, and maybe at least get a couple of volunteers. If we got one volunteer out of it, we'd be happy, across all fire companies, but we certainly welcome the young. If anybody's in the school district here, please encourage anybody that's in the sophomore, junior class to come to the ceremony and see what it's all about. Thank you very much. So we will meet in executive session after this. Mr. Siegel.
I want to make one comment that I think probably goes for this entire board. And I always say this, that the one meeting a year I really wish I didn't have to attend, that I dislike the most, is this one. We are blessed, unlike a lot of other communities, with a large number of qualified people who have applied for all of these boards, all of these commissions. And I know, speaking for myself, where you saw that we had differences of opinion, there was not one time where, at least for me and I believe my colleagues, where we were voting ever against someone. We were making decisions as to who we thought were best for a particular board. Sometimes that means change, sometimes it means maintaining the status quo, but it's a really tough meeting because, I know some people will leave less than satisfied because they weren't appointed or whatever, but it's not because we didn't consider everyone or that we really had an embarrassment of riches, as Commissioner Holmes said. The number of applicants and the qualifications were astounding, and I only wish we could appoint more. So in case people are watching, we really thought about this, and it's the worst meeting of the year because you're saying no to some really, really, really good people who want to be involved, and I just hope they stay involved one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Siegel, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bill, could I just say, we were in competition, you said we're in competition with the fire on the 14th, our Guild board. We really had no choice on that date. It's the only date that we could get a venue big enough, on a Tuesday night. So we apologize to the volunteers that we will not be there, and we have to have this meeting that night. But it couldn't be avoided. So I do apologize.
No, that's no problem. The good news is our constituents have this Thursday or next Tuesday to go to a billboard meeting to find more about it. So this Thursday at the Haverford School at 7 o'clock, and next Tuesday at Manoa Fire Company. So we stand adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night.